Alright, so today for video test number 2 we are looking at Jack London's Call of the Wild and Jack London's To Build a Fire. Basically, we're going to be going over the plot, characterization, setting, imagery, and theme, and pretty much comparing the similarities, and then overall why are these so important. So first I'm going to go over plot. For Call of the Wild, the plot was about a dog named Buck, where he's stolen from his home and sold into service as a sled dog in Alaska. He becomes progressively feral in the harsh environment where he is forced to fight to survive and dominate other dogs. And To Build a Fire places man within the realm of nature at its worst, a miner who went to the Yukon to find gold. He travels toward camp on a cold, windy afternoon against the advice of a seasoned miner. He falls through ice, gets his feet wet, which leads him to build a fire to dry off and warm up. Both of these stories deal with the survival of the fittest due to the harsh environments. Both the plots deal with outdoors during the winter time. And this relates back to Jack London because during this time period, he also, when he was alive, he went to the mines during the gold rush. He went to places like Alaska. So you can really see the description of detail, which we will get into eventually, and how important it was. And how, like, the rich detail really makes, is very important to the story. Next is characterization. I found a picture that shows how Buck was during when he was fighting in one of the chapters. In this photo, he is fighting another dog because he killed others. It also shows how powerful Buck is and how he evolves from a pamper pet into a fierce and most masterful animal. Though he loves his master John, he feels the wild calling him away from civilization and longs to reconnect with the primitive roots of his species. This really shows at the beginning of the Buck, especially when Buck is first introduced. An example from the text is Buck lived at a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, Judge Miller's place it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden among the trees. And then later into the chapter, Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his. He plunged into the swimming tank, went hunting with the judge's son. So first, obviously, Buck went into the water. He's pretty much his own dog. Then To Build a Fire, we look at Jack London puts a man against nature, a lone man who faces extreme cold as he treks through Yukon to meet his friends. The only other character is his dog, who shows a greater amount of respect for nature than the man does. Both have strong dog characters in both the short stories, who have natural senses and know how to survive. Dogs have the primal instincts of survival and usually guide their owners, especially during this time period. It was pretty much all new. They didn't really have the things like we have now, especially when it comes to camping and things like that. So, this is important because it just shows us how these dogs really were smart and how big of a role and an impact they can make, especially on their owners. And when we take a better look into Build a Fire, his owner, the main character, doesn't really know what to do unless his dog was there to pretty much guide him. For setting an example from an outside source, I took a look into the article National Endowment for the Arts Reader Resources, The Call of the Wild. An example of that was 1897, thousands joined the Klondike Gold Rush, including London, who journeys to Alaska in July. This helped him get the idea of the wilderness to create the setting for both stories. So this was a huge. This meant a lot because this also gave us the idea of like the rich detail of the stories. For example, let me find it real quick. On page 363, the first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capacity to adjust himself to changing conditions, the lack which would have meant swift and terrible death. And another, let's see if I can get it up, this picture I found. So I found this picture. This picture is an illustration from The Call of the Wild, and to me, it shows like how fast the water was moving, especially during the winter months when we had all the snow that was melting daily, and how fast the rapids were moving. Imagery is what I'll be next getting into. For Call of the Wild, it's an example from it is it seemed as though their bones would burst through their skin. This was, I don't remember what chapter it's from, but I have page 27. I don't know exactly what page it is from here, but I found a nice piece of imagery. This shows when the dogs attacked camp. And then the next example was from below came the fatal roaring where the wild current went wilder. This is describing the current of the river, which was that photo I showed to. And to me, it plays a huge importance in understanding the environment because a lot of people never really risk their lives to go into the water to save anyone, especially during this time of year, whereas Buck, he jumped into the water to save his owner, John, which is something not a lot of people would even done, so it just shows, going back to characterization, how brave Buck was. An example of imagery from To Build a Fire is the frozen moisture of its breathing had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost, and especially where its jowls, muzzles, and eyelashes whitened by its crystallized breath. This describes a accompanying dog. They use a metaphor to describe the dog and how cold it was. This also goes back to setting because most of the time this was placed in the winter months. It was hot. It was always cold. And this is in Alaska mostly, so it just shows you like how cold it was being there. Especially when you look at the dog character in To Build a Fire, it's just amazing how his breath just freezes in the air. So these are both of these like examples from each text are describing the harsh environment, rich in details, especially when they're faced with many challenges. Next is theme. A theme that's common for both stories is man versus nature because you see in both stories that man doesn't exactly know what to do to survive. For example, let me bring up the picture I found for To Build a Fire. So this is the picture I found for To Build a Fire. This shows this man, the man character in To Build a Fire. He is freezing, he is underprepared, he doesn't know what to do because he left during a time when it's really hard to travel, although he should have listened, but he went against what people were telling him and advising him to do. And it shows his dog whose natural instincts are pretty much guiding him to where he needs to go, because the dog pretty much knows what to do. And then to go looking back to Call of the Wild, it's going back to survival of the fittest. Buck fights pretty much all these. He fights dogs. He fights man. He fights a bear. It just shows you how strong and powerful Buck really is. And all these literary elements are important because it just shows how harsh it was pretty much during this time of year when it was cold. And it just shows how powerful really and how smart, in my opinion, dogs really are. Because I know a lot of people these days underestimate dogs for their intelligence, but they're actually really smart and strong animals.